The night pressed against the museum's ocean wing as the narrator described the hush before a storm. Dr. Elena Cross traced salt stains on an ancient chart and said, "The coordinates repeat like a heartbeat." Noah Reed leaned in and said, "Patterns do not promise land." The glass ceiling throbbed with distant thunder, while Elena weighed risk like a coin between fingers. Lyra Chen arrived with a smile that did not reach her eyes and said, "A grant board will fund you if you promise restraint." The narrator noted restraint had never fed discovery. A sealed letter waited, wax cracked, edges burned. Gabriel Thorne had written in a hand like surf and said, "Beware the man who hides in light." Professor Marcus Vale strode from the shadows and said, "My archives close at midnight." The narrator marked the hour as a hinge. Elena folded the chart and said, "Atlantis is not a fable we chase. It is a fault we mend." Noah said, "Then mend it before it swallows you." The storm finally spoke across the bay. The narrator followed the group into the archive where air smelled of brine and vellum. Rows of ledgers slept like buried reefs. Marcus Vale said, "Touch nothing you cannot explain." Elena lifted the letter and said, "Clarity follows courage." Noah scanned for exits the way sailors count stars. Lyra drifted beside a locked cabinet and said, "Funding demands results, not legends." The narrator observed how the word legends can disguise maps. A floor grate hummed with the building's tired lungs. Elena matched symbols on the chart to a ledger spine. A loose slip fell, stamped with a trident and latitude fragments. Noah said, "Someone wanted this lost." Marcus Vale said, "Or found by the correct hands." The narrator weighed the word correct and found it heavy. The narrator charted a path across the table as Elena arranged artifacts into a logic the storm could respect. She set the trident slip near the compass and said, "These latitudes overlap seismic scars." Noah said, "Scars mean pressure in time." Lyra said, "And liability." Marcus Vale opened a drawer and offered a brass astrolabe with a scholar's ceremony. The instrument glinted like a coin tossed to fate. Elena said, "We triangulate from the ridge." The narrator felt the room lean toward a point offshore. A generator throbbed, and the lights dimmed as if the ocean had inhaled. Noah said, "Say it." Elena said, "We sail at first light." Silence followed like a treaty signed without witnesses. The narrator tracked Elena to the loading bay where rain braided into ropes. She pressed a palm to a crate marked with maritime permits. Noah said, "You promised restraint." Elena said, "I promise truth." Forklifts slept like beasts under tarps. Lyra checked her tablet and said, "Your vessel is flagged for inspection." Marcus Vale arrived with 2 weathered cases and said, "Borrowed, not stolen." The bay lights buzzed and shed halos on wet concrete. Elena signed the manifest in a hand that did not shake. The narrator heard the sea drum against pylons like a countdown. Noah said, "If we go together." Elena said, "Together is the only way we come back." The narrator opened on a pier where gulls carved the wind, and the storm limped east. The research boat idled, lights blinking like patient eyes. Elena stepped aboard and said, "Mark every reading." Noah said, "And every risk." Lyra remained on the pier and said, "Funding requires updates." Marcus Vale said, "History requires witnesses." The line cast off with a slap that sounded final. Elena set the chart in a waterproof sleeve and said, "Course by the ridge, adjust for swell." The narrator felt the bay widen into a question. Buoys nodded as if they knew the answer. Noah said, "This could end careers." Elena said, "Or begin them." Dawn bled through low clouds as the research boat rode the swell, and the narrator marked a hush before choices. Dr. Elena Cross mapped the ridgeline on her tablet and said, "We follow this fault." Noah Reed checked the winch and said, "Depth first, pride later." Lyra Chen typed notes and said, "Investors need thresholds, not hunches." Marcus Vale steadied himself by the rail and said, Hunches are just unlabeled data. The sonar chirped like a cautious heart and sketched terraces beneath them. Elena said, "These steps are engineered, or time is more precise than we think." A burst of static crawled over the radio. A dry voice said, "Trim 20 degrees east, then hold your breath." The narrator felt the deck lean into the words. Noah said, "Who is on our channel?" Elena said, "Someone who knows the tide of secrets." The ridge fell away into a basin shaped like a ring. The narrator traced the sonar sweep as it painted concentric ridges that refused to be random. Elena said, "Terraced arcs, constant radius, depth 300 meters. Noah said, "We send the drop camera, nice and slow." Lyra said, "Record chain of custody on all media." Marcus Vale unlocked a waterproof case and said, "Borrowed optics will not forgive clumsy hands." The camera slid into green water, tether taut, and the winch hummed like a vow. Static returned and the voice said, "Shadows nest at the rim." Elena said, "Identify yourself." The voice said, "Names are anchors." The narrator followed the cable down through bands of light that thinned to bruise. Noah said, "Impact marks at 2 o'clock on the feed." Elena said, "Guide to the rim and hold for drift." The arcs sharpened into masonry ghosts. The narrator entered the quiet of the deep where silt rose in petals around broken edges. The camera light found blocks keyed like teeth. Elena said, "Interlocking joints, not volcanic fracture." Noah said, "Currents strong. Keep the line off the stone." Lyra said, "Tag timecode in coordinates." Marcus Vale whispered, "We are trespassers in an old grammar." A shadow crossed the beam, and the housing rattled. Elena said, "Stabilize and yaw left." The voice returned and said, "Read the pattern, not the parts." The narrator noticed spiral carvings under grime that matched the chart's margins. Noah said, "We are scraping history or a trap." Elena said, "Both can be true." The cable thrummed as if something below had breathed. The narrator returned topside where wind sharpened, and the generator coughed a complaint. Elena said, "We need cores from the terrace lip." Noah said, "Short bites, minimal disturbance." Lyra said, "Legal thresholds end at 20 kilos. Marcus Vale produced a wrapped cylinder and said, "A sampler that drinks gently." The drill rig braced like a patient animal and bit the stone. The radio crackled and a new tone cut in with authority. A clipped voice said, "Vessel Athena, hold position for inspection." Elena said, "We filed our permits." Noah watched the horizon and said, "No AI's ping returned." The narrator counted 3 wakes approaching like commas in a threat. Lyra said, "We are being audited by ghosts." Marcus Vale said, "Or by keepers who dislike light." The narrator held the deck steady as the unnamed boats circled with the patience of reefs. A voice hailed them and said, "Transmit your raw data for safety review." Elena said, "We transmit nothing until we verify provenance." Noah said, "Engines ready for evasive drift." Lyra said, "We need a legal voice now." Marcus Vale said, "Law sleeps when truth wakes." Static folded into a whisper that matched the earlier guide. The whisper said, "Cut south along the ring and the current will hide you." The narrator watched Elena choose a line with a cartographer's calm. She said, "South by 20, cut noise, maintain camera." Noah said, "Copy." Lyra said, "This will cost us favors." Marcus Vale said, "Favors return with proof." The boat slid into the fog like doubts postponed. The narrator rode the swell as the Athena slipped south along the ring. Dr. Elena Cross traced the bathymetry and said, "We dive here." Noah Reed checked seals and said, "Currents spike near the vents." Lyra Chen opened a case and said, "New batteries, verified." Marcus Vale steadied the tablet and said, "Symbols, prefer context." The whisper on radio returned and said, "Follow the colder seam." The narrator marked how trust thinned like fog. Elena said, "We hold the line on procedure." Noah said, "Procedure saved me twice." Lyra said, "And cost you once." Marcus Vale said, "Cost is the tutor of truth." The narrator followed the RAV as it slipped down the thermocline and shed the day. Light narrowed to a halo over terraces like teeth. Elena said, "Yaw, 2 degrees left." Noah said, "Line clear, tension steady." Lyra said, "I will refine gain." Marcus Vale said, "Do not refine away the ghosts." The whisper said, "Breathe with the stone." The feed flared, then calmed to reveal channels grooved by hands or centuries. Elena said, "Record full, sweep." Noah said, "Current is rising from the east." Lyra said, "Telemetry stable mostly." The narrator underlined the word mostly. The narrator held the breath of the deep as a notch opened like a keyhole in the wall. Elena said, "Guide through the aperture." Noah said, "Clearance 5 centimeters." Lyra said, "Auto-stabilize engaged." Marcus Vale whispered, "Patience is ballast." The whole camera found a chamber where silt hovered like memory. A disc lay half buried, its metal warm in the lamp. Elena said, "Mark artifact coordinate." The radio whispered, "Take only the circle." Noah said, "I can nudge it free." Lyra said, "Auto-stabilize lost." The cable jolted, and the narrator tasted fear. The narrator braced as the RAV skated, clipped a ledge, and spun silt into night. Elena said, "Counter yaw, drop thrust." Noah said, recovering. Lyra said, "Signal attenuation, unknown." Marcus Vale said, "Hold the room, not the fear." The disc wobbled free and rolled into the beam with a soft gleam. The whisper said, "Now leave." Elena said, "Stow the sample in cradle." Noah said, "Claw closed, load secure." Lyra said, "Telemetry restored." The narrator heard engines above shift into a patient idle. The narrator surfaced with the RAV as rain softened to lace, and the sea took a gentler breath. Elena said, "Seal the specimen." Noah said, "Pressure equalized, cradle locked." Lyra said, "Chain of custody begins now." Marcus Vale lifted a soft brush and said, "We will read this without wounding it." The disc showed faint characters that matched the chart margins. The whisper said, "Circles speak in tides." Elena said, "We test composition, then map the chamber." Noah said, "And we watch our flanks." Lyra said, "I am already watching." The narrator wondered what her eyes had chosen. The narrator carried the weight of discovery into the night as the Athena idled near the ridge. Dr. Elena Cross studied the disc under lamplight and said, "These lines mirror the slip fault." Noah Reed scanned the horizon and said, "One of the trailing boats has returned." Lyra Chen tapped her tablet and said, "We are being pinged without handshake." Marcus Vale said, "They want proof before we even know what we have." A knock echoed from below deck, subtle but deliberate. Elena said, "All crew accounted for." Noah said, "Then someone boarded." The narrator marked silence, folding in tight as water against hull. The narrator followed footsteps below, each creak a cipher. Elena descended with flashlight and said, "Stay sharp." Noah said, "I'll cover the hatch." Lyra said, "Keep the disc in sight." Marcus Vale muttered, "Locks only keep out the polite." In the hold, crates shifted, and a figure in oilskin turned, face half shadow. Elena said, "Identify yourself." The viewer smiled and said, "Call me Adrian Shaw, friend of your cause." The narrator noted how trust bent under weight. Elena said, "You entered uninvited." Adrian said, "The truth doesn't knock." Noah's voice cut sharp, "Step into the light." The narrator lingered on tension as Adrian Shaw spread hands and said, "I have what you lack, context." Elena said, "Context without proof is noise." Noah said, "He's stalling us." Lyra said, "Or testing us." Marcus Vale said, "What do you want?" Adrian smiled and said, "To keep you alive." The radio hissed and a clipped voice said, "Return the artifact or risk sanction." Elena said, "So you work for them?" Adrian said, I work for Atlantis, not for men. The narrator weighed the word Atlantis as if it were currency none could mint. The narrator pressed against the storm as rain thickened outside. Elena said, "You claim allegiance to Atlantis, prove it." Adrian Shaw produced a fragment etched with spirals. Marcus Vale leaned close and said, "Same script as the disc." Lyra said, "Or a forgery." Noah said, "Why smuggle it aboard?" Adrian said, "Because others would sink you for less." The hull shuddered as floodlights from a pursuing vessel cut the fog. A voice over loudspeaker said, "Heave to." The narrator felt the deck brace against command. Elena said, "Hold course." Noah said, "Engines to flank speed." Adrian smiled and said, "Now they come." The narrator carved through waves as the Athena lunged ahead, spray like shrapnel. Elena said, "We cannot outrun forever." Noah said, "But we can vanish in the shoals." Lyra said, "Depth maps show a canyon." Marcus Vale said, "The canyon was drawn centuries ago." Adrian Shaw said, "And Atlantis sleeps in its mouth." The pursuing vessel's lights veered, hesitant. Elena said, "Then we dive into shadow." Noah said, "Risk of grounding is high." Adrian said, "Risk is the language of discovery." The narrator held the moment taut as wire before it snapped. The narrator opened on dawn bruised by storm clouds as the Athena nosed into a canyon of jagged shoals. Dr. Elena Cross studied the map overlay and said, "This is the entrance." Noah Reed steadied the wheel and said, "Tides pulling harder than charts suggest." Lyra Chen checked the sonar and said, "Depth variance increasing fast." Marcus Vale leaned against the railing and said, "These walls are carved like scripture." Adrian Shaw said, "Atlantis waits beyond this throat." The narrator felt the canyon close around them like ribs of a beast. Elena said, "Engines low, trim steady." Noah said, "Every rock here has teeth." Lyra said, "Signal interference rising." The narrator underlined how silence in the radio meant watchers near. The narrator moved with the vessel as sonar painted a chasm plunging beneath them. Elena said, "This depth is unrecorded." Noah said, "If we slip, we vanish." Lyra said, "I am logging every meter." Marcus Vale murmured, "A map without legend is just a prayer." Adrian Shaw said, "The prayer is answered below." The hull vibrated with currents like distant drums. Elena said, "Drop probe and stabilize." Noah said, "Probe ready descending." Lyra said, "Telemetry unstable but readable." The narrator felt history pull like undertow. Marcus Vale said, "Every myth casts a shadow, and we just stepped inside it." The narrator followed the probe feed as images bloomed with stone arches draped in coral. Elena said, "Engineered curvature, not chance." Noah said, "Struts intact at this depth." Lyra said, "Timecode locked, resolution high." Marcus Vale said, "We read the grammar of ruins." Adrian Shaw said, "The outer ring is your threshold." A shape drifted into view, a statue toppled, face worn but eyes intact. Elena whispered, "Guardians." Noah said, "Or warnings." Lyra said, "Signal degrading near the base." The narrator lingered on the gaze of stone that had waited longer than memory itself. The narrator cut across tension as the Athena rolled in heavier swells. Elena said, "Prepare dive suits." Noah said, "Current risk is severe." Lyra said, "Funding never covered entry." Marcus Vale said, "History doesn't file permits." Adrian Shaw held the fragment beside the disc, spiral lines aligning. Elena said, "The pieces match." The narrator noted how truth fit like puzzle teeth. Noah said, "We go but with tethers." Lyra said, "I'll stay topside to log." Marcus Vale said, "I dive." Adrian Shaw smiled and said, "Then you will see the mouth itself." The storm split open to reveal a pale patch of sky. The narrator held breath as divers slipped into the sea like ink drops. Elena said, Stay on comms, mark every landmark. Noah said, lines secured, tension good. Marcus Vale said, the current feels alive. Adrian Shaw drifted easily and said, you swim in the veins of Atlantis. Lyra's voice crackled from the deck, telemetry stable. The ruins yawned wider, stairs vanishing into sand. Elena said, these steps were carved for feet, not fins. Noah said, then we walk the impossible. Marcus Vale whispered, so much waiting in silence. The narrator felt history breathe against them like tide against stone. The narrator followed the divers, as the canyon fell away to a cathedral of stone. Dr. Elena Cross said, we keep the line tight and the light kinder than our doubts. Noah Reed said, thermals rising from the vent, adjust trim. Lyra Chen said, surface link stable, recording all channels. Marcus Vale said, the script on these blocks repeats like tide prayer. Adrian Shaw said, you stand at the vestibule. The radio cut to a stern cadence and said, cease intrusion or we intervene. Elena said, we document, we do not deface. Noah said, gate ahead, pressure seams across the arch. Lyra said, telemetry wobble, magnetic spikes. Adrian said, open the circle with the disc. The narrator felt the ocean pause, as if listening for an old password. The narrator crossed the threshold as silt rose like incense. Elena said, place the disc and do not force what yields to time. Noah said, cradle aligned, minimal contact. Lyra said, surface vessels shifting position, unknown intent. Marcus Vale said, the motif pairs inward like a lock that prefers listening. Adrian Shaw said, turn it with the current, not the hand. The disc settled and a low hum braided with the sea. The arch released a thin ribbon of bubbles and star-like motes drifted from seams. Elena said, chamber pressure equalizing. Noah said, readings are strange, but within margin. Lyra said, I am losing the outer feed. The narrator tasted the moment as metal tastes rain. The narrator heard the keepers will arrive as a tremor that shook loose the quiet. A heavy thud echoed from above and the entry stones flexed like ribs. Elena said, external force on the arch, brace. Noah said, tension spikes on the line, preparing counter. Lyra said, unknown craft deploying charges, vector uncertain. Marcus Vale said, the hinge stone will fail before the ward does. Adrian Shaw said, then let the canyon eat their noise. The tremor grew teeth and a crack ran across a keystone. Elena said, we hold it or we lose the door. Noah said, I can wedge the brace but the surge will take someone. The narrator felt the room inhale like a living vault deciding whom to keep. The narrator watched decision sharpen as Marcus Vale shifted his weight and set the wedge. Elena said, on my mark, release the brace to the keystone. Noah said, I have you, do not drift. Lyra said, surface craft locking floodlights, count down on their sweep. Marcus Vale said, a library pays its debt to a door. Adrian Shaw said, there is another way if you trust me. The surge hit like a sentence ending hard. Marcus cut his tether with a clean motion and jammed the wedge home. Elena said, Marcus, no. Noah said, hold him. Adrian's silhouette slid back with the current, hands empty. The narrator felt the wedge bite and the arch hold while one life spun into the blue. The narrator held the quiet after impact, a silence stitched by grief and purpose. Elena said, we do not spend his gift on fear. Noah said, the door is stable, the path open. Lyra said, surface threat receding, someone just ordered them off. Adrian Shaw said, the city guards its own when honored. Elena said, you knew a price was due. Adrian said, Atlantis never opens to unpledged hearts. The chamber breathed, and the inner gate unfurled like a pupil. Noah said, we go or we lose the window. Lyra said, I will hold the world outside. Elena said, then we carry witness forward. The narrator watched the light within bend like dawn underwater, and the descent began. The narrator entered a corridor where pale light flowed like slow fire. Dr. Elena Cross said, "We hold course until the city speaks." "Noah read," said, "pressure steady, line clean." Lyra Chen said, "Surface is quiet, too quiet." Adrian Shaw said, "Atlantis prefers whispers to applause." Glyphs woke along the walls and traced spirals toward a domed chamber. Elena said, "This geometry repeats tidal cycles." Noah said, "Then doors open on rhythms, not keys." Lyra said, "Telemetry is stable again, as if invited." The radio bled a formal tone and said, "Return what you took and leave." Adrian said, "They want the circle, not the truth." Elena said, "We bring proof, or we bring silence." The narrator watched the dome brighten like a thought finishing itself. The narrator rose into the dome, where a plaza of stone slept under glassy water. Statues ringed the space, faces worn thin by centuries. Elena said, "Central dais, install the disc." Noah said, "Brace for any pressure swing." Lyra said, "All channels recording at high bitrate." Adrian said, "Place it at the heart, then listen." Elena set the disc, and the platform breathed. Columns shivered, and a mural ignited, showing a city before the wave. The radio became a new voice and said, "This is Keeper Salcedo." Keeper Salcedo said, "Artifacts remain under protection." Elena said, "Knowledge remains under history, not fear." The narrator felt the plaza tilt toward judgment. The narrator leaned close as the mural moved like memory returning. Waves climbed a skyline, and a beacon failed. A figure at a console matched Gabriel Thorne's portrait. Elena said, "He warned us from the start." "Noah," said Thorne tried, and someone shut him down. Lyra said, "Playback shows a manual override." Adrian said, "This city drowned itself to hide the truth." Keeper Salcedo said, "Your mentor staged that failure." Elena said, "Marcus Vale died to open this door." The mural rewound to reveal hands, not thorns, on the kill switch. Lyra whispered, "Those hands are mine." The narrator heard the word betrayal arrive like a bell. The narrator gathered the fracture lines that run through trust. Lyra said, "I was told the grant required safeguards." Keeper Salcedo said, "Safeguards meant suppression." Noah said, "You fed them our course." Lyra said, "Only until they aim to erase us." Elena said, "Then choose a side that breathes." The dome hummed as the dais lifted a sealed capsule. Adrian said, "The archives see." Keeper Salcedo said, "Return it, and you live." Elena said, "We carry witness for the world." Lyra stepped between Elena and the dais and said, "Then I carry the risk." The narrator felt a cord cut and retied in the same motion. The narrator marked the city's answer as currents shifted like curtains. Floodlights from above stabbed the water, then died as the canyon swallowed their power. Keeper Salcedo said, "You will not exit with the seed." Adrian said, "Then the city will exit with us." Elena cradled the capsule and said, "We ascend on the next calm." Noah said, "Guideline true, ascent profile loaded." Lyra said, "I will block their uplink and open ours." The mural dimmed and the statues turned to face the gate. The dais sank and the door unlatched with a soft pulse. Elena said, "We go now." The narrator watched them rise through a shaft of light like survivors, returning from a long dream.